All
Go.
right. So welcome, everybody. I'm Karen Edwards, and we're all here today with Navigating What's Next, Part 2. I'd like to start by introducing our panelists, and we do have one new person joining us this time. First, Samantha Fisher. Samantha is the Director of Workplace Strategy for Transwestern. We have Andrew MacGregor, who's the President of Ascend Construction. Robert Teed, who's the Vice President of Corporate Services for ServiceNow, and our new participant, Eric Gannon, who is a principal in charge of workplace design for Gensler. So thank you guys once again for being generous with your time and coming back. Kind of hard to believe that it's been 6 months since we did our last panel together. For those of you who are listening in, after that panel was over, we sort of decided it would be fun to get back together in 6 months and see how well we did and where we were. I think the biggest surprise probably was that we didn't expect to be quite as shut down as we continue to be. But we're going to talk about that in relation to our workplace environments. So we're going to do a little reflecting. We're also going to provide some perspective on the present. And then we're going to once again glance into the future to see if our crystal balls can predict some of the changes or the influences that we think will remain with us even when we move back to a more open society. So we have roughly 10 questions to cover. Our panelists were very generous and agreed to not know what these questions were ahead of time. So we'll be a little bit more spontaneous today. And I want to start out with the first question and ask each of you to give me a couple of minutes of your own perspective from your professional career on what's happened in the last 6 months. What happened that you thought would happen? What hasn't happened? Or what kind of surprises have you seen? So Sam, you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our session. This is really fun. And myself and Robert and Eric and Andrew have kind of been laughing in our previous conversations around sort of where we've landed here. So I think for those of y'all that don't know, Transwestern is a commercial real estate organization, provides services, investment and development across the board and across the family of companies. And I think for us, one of the things that's been pretty interesting and a big surprise is that even with the shutdown, what I will call the commercial real estate and to some degree corporate real estate continued to move quite rapidly. Actually, there was a lot of questions that people were posing. It didn't shut down sort of development or investment in properties or in projects that were already under construction. And it really did shift the conversation around space and brokerage and taking down new space, or what does my space footprint look like? And I would say that is something that we probably did predict, maybe not as explicitly in our last call, but we did talk a lot about that. And I think the other thing that came from was the continued conversation around hybridized working styles. So whether that was full remote, partially in the office, that has always been on the fringe of the conversation around workplace design, how much space you have. I mean, it really did accelerate it. And we saw that with all of our clients, where many of our clients' conversations shifted from, I have a space that I need to get, or I'm growing, or I'm contracting, to let's actually take a step back and really look at our space relative to how we want our work styles to work. So I think, the hybridized work style normalized during COVID and really will continue to accelerate post-COVID. And then the other piece that I think that really accelerated, again, that has been a little bit on the fringe, is the technology community. So how much technology can support the workplace, and when you use it the right way as a tool instead of an answer for something, it really can drive a very differentiated experience. And I think very progressive organizations, and Robert's part of one, I used to be at Capital One, I think very progressive organizations were already using technology to enhance the workplace. And now it's a bit of a table stakes, because not only can it enhance the workplace, but it supports sort of the confidence and the comfort that employees need to come back to a workplace of any sort or statute.
Mm-hmm.
Great, Sam. You've already started off with a new word. I think that pivot was a word that popped up a lot in our last one, and now the hybridized work environment. That's pretty amazing. So, Robert, you mentioned, specifically that you come from that technology perspective. You want to add your thoughts?
Yeah, and I'll also add, when we got together in April for this panel, our company was roughly maybe 35 days into sending everybody home. And so we were still like very much into the emergency response kind of mode. And I don't think anybody, and in fact, I think at that point we actually had a date that, oh yeah, we'll return to the office later in this calendar year. So I don't think, while I think a lot of our predictions held true, I don't think, at least from my perspective, we were envisioning this to be something that we would eventually anniversary, right? We'll by the time we're all back in the workplace, it'll be well over 12 months, maybe 18 months. So, what's been interesting to think about during that time, and we sort of reflect on April, is how well, a lot of companies, ours included, have sort of settled into this very prolonged way of working that's quite different than the way it was sort of pre-pandemic. So as I kind of reflect back, at that time, it sort of felt like this would, be over soon. Relatively soon now, it feels like it's going to be with us a long time. And yet I'm so proud of how well so many companies have just sort of settled in and just gotten on with it, and businesses continue to operate. And to Sam's point, a big part of that is technology, because what's enabled all of this to happen up to this point and will continue to enable is the fact that, that we've got robust technologies that enable people to kind of work from anywhere in hybridized environments. I think are very much going to be part of our future, and that gets so much of that's going to be powered by these really important technologies that are going to continue to allow us to work, sort of wherever we are. And so I don't know that we had a real clear view on that back in April. I think we all thought there was certain technologies that were important. I think those have become crystal clear, though, where we are right now in the pandemic, and certainly where they'll play a role as we go forward.
Great. Eric, love to hear from your perspective.
Absolutely. I thought you'd put me last to really ice me as the newbie.
But, surprise!
Yeah. Well, certainly surprising is that, the monotony and how long this is dragged on. The hardest part, especially coming from a creative field, is we rely on healthy disruption to fuel our innovative potential and our creativity. And there's only so much you can get from the disruption that really fuels that in an environment where it doesn't feel like it used to. Being in urban centers, running into people you don't see every day, that kind of spurring of new thinking and collaborations with others. So, the one thing that's been really surprising to me is it makes sense that we'd be focused on right now. But I think prior to this entire experience, we were already starting to see our work environments needing to pivot towards something else. And while we're still working on the solutions for now, it's a perfect opportunity to be thinking way into the future as to what do we want the environments to be? What level of humanity do we want to be present within the work environments? Totally agree with Robert. In particular, that technology is something we're heavily relying on now, and we're going to rely on in the future. But how do we make that hybrid reality something that really accelerates a human experience that you seek out within the work environment? So there really is this amazing opportunity now to maybe to resist the urge to jump right on a solution and implement it, and really ask some really good questions and contemplate where you want to be in the future. So I think that's a prediction. It's a little bit of a surprise that we're so fixated on now, because we do have this great opportunity in front of us to fix the things that weren't right about workplace, that we maybe went a little too far over decades. And also really look to a really bright, optimistic future. We're going to have great work environments in the future that we didn't get to enjoy prior, or we kind of they ran their course a little bit. So now here we are. We're a little bit of a carte blanche environment, and that's pretty exciting as a designer. It's great.
Yeah, I love it. It's fabulous. Andrew, you want to bring us home with your thoughts on this?
Sure. It's interesting to be back here. I don't think anyone thought this was going to drag on this long. Everybody's kind of thinking like, oh, July, fall, we'll have shutdowns and we'll be back to business as usual. As far as the predictions went versus what played out, I think we thought that there were going to be a lot more of the office retrofit, immediate, let's get people and put up acrylic dividers and upgrade the HVAC. And I think everyone took more of a wait and see approach. And in construction, I see it sort of all boiling down to conscientiousness, and the way that we have to react to our clients. And that conscientiousness, depending on the level within an organization, created arbitrage. And I think that's what really has led to some companies doing really well, being able to pivot, focus more on their employees, more on their clients' needs, be a little bit more understanding, and approach things with kid gloves, whether it's your own people, it's your project partners, because we're all going through this awful situation. We're trying to make the best of it. And I think we're really seeing the cream start to rise, not just within our own ranks and among the people that we do business with as peers, subcontractors, but within the clients and the architects. So I think that's kind of the bright spot coming out of this is it's really driving innovation. And I think it's causing a lot of the companies who are well positioned, who already treated their employees well, were dynamic, able to service people in a very human way to excel.
Well, I'm thrilled to hear the optimism that all of you are portraying, and particularly thinking about innovation and sort of the pause that we're in is going to really reflect itself in creativity and enhanced work environments is sort of the theme I'm picking up. So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about from our customers' perspective. And Sam, I'll start with you. What are the things that your customers are most concerned about or asking about?
So it's funny because Robert alluded to it. I think the first time we had this panel, many of us had just really kind of pulled the trigger on remote working. And where all of us have sort of lived and breathed a lot of workplace pieces or operations. How do you think about how you deliver workplaces and what do you do with inside a workplace? At least for us, a lot of our clients had never actually experienced anything like this before. The majority of them were full in the office clients. And so candidly, we were a little bit ahead of the game for them. And some of the things that we were talking about with them in terms of how do you think about what the workplace could look like? How do you think about this as an opportunity? And I like Eric's perspective around how it's going to really drive transformation. And where we've seen it drive transformation is actually in business operations. So, which is maybe doesn't feel nascent to or tangential to our conversation, but actually really does. And so for a lot of our clients, they've used this as an opportunity to reinvent their business operations. And so therefore they're going to design a workplace that actually supports an optimized business function for a lot of our customers. The other thing that the majority of our customers have been asking about actually right now is how do we start to think about a reentry plan, and what are the components that we actually need to really consider?
Right.
And if we're going to have a hybridized work scenario, what does that actually mean? Because it's one thing to say, okay, a portion of your company is not going to come back to a physical environment anymore, but it's the cultural components of it that really have a much more bigger impact on it. And the conversations that we're talking about with our clients is, business culture and organizational culture is like an iceberg. 20% of it is what you see above the water, which is all the things that organizations state, right? It's your mission, it's your goals, it's the stories you tell. But there's 80% of an organization's culture that happens underneath the water, and that just happens through casual collisions or sitting around a table with a more senior person and watching them talk to a client or talk to a subordinate, and that sort of organic teachings. Organizations really have to think about that. So we've been having a lot of conversations with organizations on how do you structure that, how do you build that, and what are the things you need to think about to kind of get to that place before we even start talking about how much square footage you actually need.
Right. Anyone else have some perspective that'd like to add to Sam's comments?
Yeah, I think there was sort of a transition May, June, after everybody had been, working remotely for 2-3 months. And probably sometime end of June, mid-July, was just tired. And I think most companies had that epiphany that, yeah, we can figure out how to get the tasks done, but we can't keep building a company and a culture on Zoom. And so I think at that point, everyone kind of realized, okay, we're going to get back to the office. This is all going to be okay. It might be longer than we think, but there was sort of this commitment towards figuring out how to work differently in the office, make it safe, and get everybody back there so you could mentor, train, and bring the next generation of employees up through the organization.
Yeah, if I could add, Karen, I end up with 2 customers, right? I have all of our employees. Those are my sort of primary customers. what's been interesting is my persona, what I do for the company, has become important to our external customers as well. And we ended up, frankly, developing a whole new suite of products that sort of support how companies think about return to workplace, et cetera. And I think what's really been interesting for what we're hearing from our customers, internal, right? So the employees that I service plus our external customers is exactly what was just said. How do we continue to culturize in this very hybridized environment, distributed environment? And we're hearing a little bit different things, like people aren't really rushing back to the workplace and rushing back to be together. And I'll just say that technology, again, has become a really important part of it. And it's really forcing us internally, but also our external customers to really emphasize what we would call their digital transformation. How do we digitize all these different things that we do so that our employees can be really productive and successful while they're in this distributed environment, especially if you think about that hybridized environment that was mentioned earlier, right? Where does technology play in that? So it's been really sort of fascinating. My role normally wouldn't get that much exposure to our external customers, but because of my role in workplace, it's actually been an important persona, and it's helped us think about how we position products and things like that. And technology has been so important to the way people are thinking about what's going on right now and then what's going on in the future.
Excellent. Eric, it's a great segue into the next question, actually, because, we keep hearing, well, the open plan is dead. We're going back high panels and closed off spaces. And then in contradiction, we hear a lot about, well, we really want people to be back in the office when we want to have group meetings or team meetings and a real open environment. So what are you seeing, and what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have fallen into the trap of declaring one or the other, and I think it's there's an intentionality that needs, I think, to be discussed further than actually what is the environment. And yeah, for a long time, an open office was the most dramatic demonstration of culture. You could see it, you could kind of feel it. And I think, the thing that we're all enjoying potentially from home are some of the comforts, the intimacy, the kind of I know how to use my space aspect. And I think going forward, the intentionality of I'm going to go there for a purpose, and whether it is collaboration or it's learning or it's to see people or to experience, I think that part of it isn't really directly tied to a space typology. It's really meant to be more, we're going to understand how people are going to use space. We're all using polling tools, we're surveying, we're hyper curious about what will people use the work environments, how often will they use them, and that's pointing to purpose-driven environments. So and I think that really leads to an opportunity around how do you communicate that intentionality. And in the future, there's going to have to be operating systems, and Robert, you can tee this one up, but the software and kind of the way in which you communicate, what do I need today, what do I need for a period of time if you're on a project. So I know I didn't answer your question. I don't think it's necessarily all open, all closed. I don't know that we're going to see dramatic shifts in our environments, but I do think there's going to be a real intentionality around how we use the space and really thinking about the purpose. And then, there will be changes to space. But I think it's also, there's got to be a recognition that, the space of tomorrow or the space of a year from now or 10 years from now, we need to consistently revisit them. And this is going to force us to really be more on the ball in terms of evaluating the use and the effectiveness of our space. So I do think that's coming, where there's going to be a lot less set it and leave it, and a lot more, how is this working for me?
Excellent. So Andrew, I'd love to hear from your perspective, how has the physical space changed from pre-COVID to today? And then what are some of the conversations that are happening with your clients that possibly would not have happened if we hadn't experienced what we've been through in the last 6 months?
That's there's probably really three main things that we've seen adjusted. One is really just the amount of dense office spaces. You know, you're seeing less seas of cubicles. People are more mindful, not just of the fact that people are going to work from home. One firm that we had, it was a law firm that we were talking to pre-pandemic and then still talking to, and they were going to take 4 floors of space. Headcount stayed the exact same. They're going to 3 1/4 because they know that there's a large segment that could work from home. The second thing is more low-hanging fruit stuff. You know, touchless faucets where you can have them, maybe antimicrobial door hardware, automatic operators, making spaces lower touch, and then also like less traffic through them. And I think the third thing is really just there's this, it's like I said before with the conscientiousness, there's just more mindfulness about the perception and how employees feel in the space, whether they feel safe. And I've heard a couple of employees talk about, you know, spreading out break areas or having 2 break areas instead of 1, just because they're worried about the perception of having that many people in one space. And some of the other things we've seen enter that conversation are like providing shower facilities and upgrading HVAC systems with bipolar ionization and HEPA filters, just so that the employees feel like something's being done on their behalf and they do feel safe going back to work. Because I think there's going to be this sort of this trauma that certain people feel of like being anxious going back to work. You know, whether the pandemic is over or not, we've had this, you know, we're going to have a year of this behavior of avoiding each other, wearing masks, not being in high dense spaces. And I think some people are going to struggle with it. So I think certain employers are mindful of that and they're starting to have those discussions. How do we make people feel okay going back to the office?
That's a great transition. Sam, you deal with lots of different types of clients and different sizes of companies. Is there any pattern between small companies versus large companies or global companies? Are there different behaviors going on?
I don't think they're truly material. There are definitely, because scale is the biggest probably point of inflection. So if you're in a very large global company, a lot of times you have a very deep bench of internal resources. A little bit to Robert's point, where you know he's got 2 sets of customers and clients. And so a lot of times the resources and the availability in larger organizations are easier for them to support this transition into a more hybridized working style. What we have seen is, you know, in what I will call industrial sectors, in manufacturing sectors, in some healthcare sectors, that's not as easy to do. And so they're really working through what does that actually look like for those types of sectors. But I think and obviously in smaller sectors too, if they're a small organization, just the perspective on, and candidly, the overhead and the cost of real estate can be pretty prohibitive for those kinds of organizations. So I think that the biggest, if there was one component I look at across all the different the clients that we service, it's really about scale. So organizations that have scale and that are not in rapid hypergrowth seem to be faring better in this scenario, and thinking about a lot of the things like Eric talked about. What is the purpose of our workplace? How do we do it? The things that Robert talked about, which is what is the culture and how do we support that in a hybridized environment, where I think smaller organizations or to some degree newer organizations are really just trying to figure out how to maintain what they had pre-pandemic.
Cool. Robert, if you could kind of continue that conversation, and then I'm going to pose another question, and that is, work from home permanent? Is it a new part of the culture?
So I'll answer the first part. So I think Eric, you know, this intentionality piece and purpose that Eric brought up and that Sam just highlighted, absolutely. I think, you know, as an end user, right, as a corporate user of space, we are really thinking about, we think that heads down work that we would have done pre-pandemic is going to be done other places. So Karen, that's sort of answering both of your questions. And that means that we need to be very intentional, very purposeful about what the company workplace is all about. And all the fears that Andrew talked about, right? There is going to be a whole community of people that aren't willing to come back to the workplace, maybe ever. And so we will continue to have these distributed workforces, workplaces, et cetera. And so the purpose of workplace has probably shifted permanently. And so being very intentional about when you come to the office, what is that reason that you're coming? It's probably not to do heads down work. It's probably to do something else. And then to your question, like, well, is this permanent? Absolutely. I think there's been a massive shift. And I'll tell you the way I think about it is that whether it's work from home or not, that employees have been given the choice of where they work. And that's limited to probably knowledge workers. But so now that the shift from who owns the choice of where I do my work has shifted to the knowledge worker. And I think that's a really big deal, because then that opens up this idea of, well, I can choose wherever I work. I may choose to work from the office. I may choose to work from home. I may work in this hybridized environment that we're talking about. And that shift of choice is pretty important, pretty structural. And it really opens up what the workplace can do and what it can become for individuals.
Right. Andrew, want to add some thoughts to that?
Yeah, we're seeing, and I think the data about real estate in suburban markets spiking speaks to this, but to what Sam was saying about scale and Robert was saying about, being accommodating, we're seeing a lot more of these large companies shift to a hub and spoke model where, they're not taking 400,000 feet in downtown Chicago, they're taking 150, and then they're taking 50 in Oak Brook and 50 in Deerfield, and then some of it's going away because they're letting people work from home. So it is sort of shifting the nature of where offices are and where they can be. And I think for big urban cities like Chicago, it's probably good for the suburbs and probably bad for downtown for a while, but it's also giving big tech firms pause about, do we really need everyone in the Bay Area, or can we have an office in Austin, in Columbus, and Dallas, and Chicago? And so we're going to feel some of the benefits of that.
Eric, you alluded to this in your earlier comments. Would you like to add some thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first on the hub and spoke model, I think there's certainly, it's a model that's brand new and is being kind of tested and explored. There is something pretty powerful about bringing your whole organization to one place. That this will undoubtedly affect culture and how culture plays out. There's something also really amazing about, really using this again as this catalyst towards really uniting the entire country around, second tier, I hate using that word, but second tier cities and cities that really maybe didn't get the emphasis are potentially going to start to see their day in the sun. And we did a survey, it's a City Pulse survey, that started to understand what are the behaviors that we might see around urban centers. And we do believe that there's going to be some shrinking back from the cities for a period of time. But there's also, going back to that intentionality, there are things that will always be present within the city and culturally embodied within the cities that we all rely on for kind of that fuel to keep us going. And I think the city worker is a really important part of who we've become, and we all work in different environments. I've personally always worked within the city, and that's been part of my kind of ethos as a worker. But yeah, just picking up on the hub and spoke, it's a very curious model and very interesting. I don't know exactly how it plays out. I'm not smart enough to know exactly how that real estate model works. From our perspective, it's really interesting, but what does it do from a shrinking of real estate or distributing of real estate is something that there are a lot of people looking at and probably can answer better than me.
So I promise I didn't tee him up, but that's exactly where we're headed next. Our last subject is real estate. And Sam, I'd love to hear from you, maybe expanding on what he just said. Will companies grow, shrink? What about social distancing? Companies like Facebook and Amazon are getting a lot of press right now about how they're managing through and, obviously telling people they can work from home. So just love to hear what you think.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and I'm going to tie a little bit of this to our previous one, which is culture. So I think, and a little bit like Robert, so I used to be a corporate end user. I used to work in the corporate side, and I had, again, the benefit to come to the commercial side. So my view on things is a little bit different now because I have a nice mix of both. But I do think that real estate, and this is going to tie into the intentionality and the purposefulness of it, is really going to be about how does real estate support business. I think a lot of times historically it was, I have a place, I have a talent pool, I have a product, or I have a client, right? And that was really kind of how real estate strategy a lot of time was designed. And I think now it's really going to be, how does it support business? How does it support culture? We're also talking about, in addition to what I'll call the hub and spoke model, which to some degree we considered a little bit of like a centralized type model, where you have decision making and culture and branding and everything that kind of starts at a central location and sort of gets pushed out and leveraged in other locations. We're also looking at, like, there's decentralized models of real estate structure, and that really is around where, you know, branding, culture, and decision making sometimes is done decentralized. It's not, and that function feels very different. And then there's sort of what we're talking about with a lot of our clients is what we're talking is the distributed one. And so the distributed one, in our view, is one that's a blend of the hub and spoke that supports the you know, the culture and the component pieces that come from a centralized organization, but also you get the same thing in a distributed model. So where a centralized one feels very central located, decentral means maybe they're not all talking together. A distributed one is you get this nice sort of cascade that every location sort of feels like I'm connected to the central location. And I think, you know, from a real estate perspective, and as organizations think about that, it's really going to come down to sort of access and availability to resources, to people, to information, to culture, and how organizations think about that. And I still think the scale piece is the biggest one that's going to be the factor that decides a lot of that, right? If you have the ability to have a scaled, distributed workforce because you're going where the talent is, you can do that. But companies that are, you know, 50 people or less, that's not as easy for them to do, because the mechanics of actually delivering those spaces is challenging.
So it's a great segue into actually our last formal question. And so just in matter of timekeeping, after that question, I think we will open Patrick will read the questions that have been coming in while you guys have been chatting. And then time permitting, I'd like each of you maybe to close with a couple of minutes of just your personal thoughts, your personal perspective, and sort of, you know, push us into the next 6 months, and maybe we'll be back here again together and see how we did. So I'm curious about companies like WeWork, Regus as two examples, you know, that were obviously what we thought was the future of the office, and huge investments in that direction. Robert, any perspective on, you know, what you think will happen with that idea?
Yeah, and so it fits into the real estate question. I think whether it's hub and spoke or whatever the terminology is, I think as an end user, as a corporate real estate person, we're thinking about creating an ecosystem of workplaces. And some of that is your traditional real estate-y stuff that we've talked about. WeWork and their brethren fit squarely into that because they become part of that flexible model.
Yeah.
And if you look at the ecosystem of it, you may say, well, I need to have a physical place in a city. You may also say that I've got a cluster of employees who are working from home that just need to convene somewhere for a day, a week, a month, whatever. And so I think I'm still very bullish on the WeWorky type products. I think they play a really important role. Even more important, in my view, when we think about this, whether it's hub and spoke, whatever terminology you want to use, this idea that our real estate portfolio has become this broader ecosystem of places for people. And so I'm bullish on that idea. I'm bullish on those companies. There's a fair amount of them that aren't going to survive probably this period, but those that do, I think, are going to be in a really good position to get, you know, enterprise business like ours as we create these more fluid real estate portfolios or ecosystems of workplaces.
Great. Eric, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the model of shared work environments has ushered in a really interesting shift in the environments that are dedicated to a corporation too. I mean, the space as a service model where there's sort of this heavy concierge, heavily cared for, as you as an individual, I think is something that we've started to adopt within dedicated corporate environments. I think that's been a great contribution from the co-working model that you're starting to see make their way into single tenancies as well. So
Right.
that, really, we all need kind of a little bit of the rule book on how to use the space or some of the prompts, and I think the co-working models do that really well. They really cater to you as the user.
Yeah, that's great. So Patrick, I'm going to turn it over to you to address the questions, and anyone who would like to respond, just step in.
Awesome, thank you. Our first question comes from Anthony Degelman, and it's regarding the work from home, freedom, where you want to work. His question is, how do you see us timing our collaboration time so that we're still able to have these candid water cooler talks or spontaneous collaborative sessions? And Sam, I know you've had a lot of great comments about technology. I feel like this might fall into some of those, that application.
Yeah, so it's, I think this is a really interesting one. And I've been talking with just some, not necessarily our clients, but other peers or other leads in workspace. And I think there's two things that probably have to get a little bit better. I think the one is actually asynchronous conversation. So that's not something that I think a lot of people are talking about. But the funniest thing for companies that deal a lot in PowerPoint was to look at what Jeff Bezos did when he banned PowerPoint at Amazon, and it was so that you could get very crisp and clear around what it is you were trying to say was your problem, what you were trying to say was the solution, and how you were going to get there. And I think, to some degree, as wonderful as collaboration is, it actually allows for a little bit of loosey-goosiness, in my opinion, and we're not always as crisp, and we maybe don't get to things as quickly as we need to. So I think one is the timing of it is there might not be as much, and so asynchronous conversation is probably going to have to get a little bit better. The second thing I think is there's this really cool sort of technology that's very immature, but for those of you all who live in the real estate world, most people know how BIM modeling came about, right? So BIM modeling was really so that you could take something that wasn't actually designed yet, and you could actually see how it was going to perform before you actually designed it and put it all together. And so there's sort of this conversation, again, on the prop tech periphery around, can you BIM model a workplace? So can you take the interior, so take which was BIM modeling was primarily for core and shell and exterior, can you take that and now actually apply those same principles to what would be inside a workplace? So maybe now you have everybody that sort of checks in, and you have an avatar and stuff like that. So there's some really cool things that I think people are exploring. But for the current state of timing, I think it is, probably a lot of it is through asynchronous conversation. And what are those other types of technologies that can support real-time communication, and sort of figuring out what type of vehicle or method makes the most sense for what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Hey, Patrick, do you mind if I jump in as well, build on what Sam just said?
Yeah, by all means.
Yeah, so I think technology plays a really important role in this, because if, for those sort of the collisions to happen, you have to know when your counterparts are going to be in the office. And so just simply creating, a way for you to see, oh, well, Anthony, you're going to be in the office on Tuesday. You know what? I think I'll come in on Tuesday. How do I see that, right? Where do I see that? And sort of traditional workplace tools wouldn't necessarily make that visible. So there's a whole new suite of tools that has to come about. A lot of what Sam just said, as well as some really basic reservation type systems that would say, yeah, I happen to know that Anthony's going to be in the office next Tuesday. And then that creates that opportunity for those casual collisions to happen in person. So really getting more into the technology that helps us identify presence. Because frankly, if I'm going to bother to drive 2 hours into the office to see Anthony, I'm going to want to know he's there, or I'm going to want to know that my team is there, or what have you. So I think that we can have the best of both worlds, and technology has to play a really important role in making, our behaviors visible.
Great. Patrick, do you need additional questions? I'm looking at them as well.
Yeah, they're kind of overlapping.
Yeah.
at this point, which is a good thing. There is one from Charlie. Are decisions being made, or Charlie Rizzo, I'm sorry, are decisions being made by clients, or is it still a wait and see environment until the vaccine is available? And this came in when we were talking about the return to the office. So again, the question is, are decisions being made by clients, or is this a wait and see environment until the vaccines are available?
Yeah, this is Robert. I mean, I can answer specifically what we're doing at ServiceNow. We are reopening offices. We have an entire robust process, and we are reopening in certain places. And frankly, in certain places, Europe is a great example where we've reopened and returned people, and now we're reclosing them, right? So there is a reopening, reclosing. I think a lot of corporate end users are kind of going through these motions of trying to get people, back into the office safely, and trying to do all the things we've talked about here, the reasons you'd physically want to be together. That it's happening. So those decisions are being made, and many corporates are trying to work their way through it now. As Sam has talked about a few times, scale matters, right? How big you are as a company, where you're located in the world will influence how you're able to do that. But certainly,
Bobby, I can't.
I have a funny kind of starting point to my response. I think the early on clients were asking us for our benchmarks over and over again, and I would laugh about that. I said, yeah, there's a good benchmark. It's about 100 years old, and we didn't have work environments like we did. And I think there's an element of certainty that our clients are seeking that might not come, at least not for a while, and certainly not one that's tailored so specifically to that culture or that client. So I think that's it's a funny ask right now, because we're all going to have to take a little bit of a leap that's right for us. So we are seeking certainty, and we're seeking benchmarks that are going to point to the solution. But we're absolutely seeing clients really slow to the draw. They're slow rolling decision making, just to take in more. And it frankly doesn't help that there are some really bullish, bold, big players out there that are drawing a line in the sand and really shooting out way far in advance. I mean, I don't want to call out the Googles and Microsofts and Dropboxes of the world, but they're really pushing so far out that a lot of people pay attention to that. And it doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's just people are taking note, and they're trying to make sense of that for themselves.
Great. Patrick, any additional questions for the group? If not, then I'm actually going to just swing over to Sam for some parting remarks. It's 2:48, so a couple of minutes from each of you.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, no, we've gone through them all and answered, I think, more on top of that. So we're good for closing statements.
Okay. So I think my perspective on this entire sort of conversation is that it's really going to highlight a lot of the things that I think sort of have been on the periphery again for real estate. And in my view, it's really about organizational and human psychology. And all the parts and pieces that go into that, like how do organizations want to operate? How do they want to engage with their employees? What are the behaviors that their employees do? And I think to what Robert and Eric and even Andy said, like all of the things that we've talked about in terms of like solutioning or things that could be coming down the way, or what are clients making decisions around, it all has a human element. And I think the more that the organizations really take a step back and say, what is the humanized element that we want to address, or we want to fix, or we want to change, or we want to invent, is really going to drive what their next appropriate workplace looks like. And I do think it's tailored based on a lot of the factors that we've talked about here, because I think that's going to be the real big piece, and the sort of the underlying one that some people are talking about, but not everybody is talking about yet, is really that mental component. And how do you ensure the mental wellness of your teams, of your clients, of all of us who work together in sort of the environment that we're trying to design.
Thank you, Sam. Great perspective. Andrew?
Yeah, I think to piggyback on what Sam's saying, we're sort of in this new realm of opportunity for the companies that are willing to develop that strategy, whatever it is, because there's no one size fits all solution. Commit and then adapt along the way. I think there are, to kind of answer Charlie's question, there are a lot of companies that are in this decision-making paralysis. They might have grown too fast. They've shut a lot of staff. Their culture is upside down. They're financially upside down. It's very hard to innovate through that. And the companies that are well-positioned and more dynamic are going to be able to commit to a plan fast and just plow through this and adapt along the way. And I think that's where there's really a lot of opportunity, whether you're in real estate, design, construction, the digital world. And it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. But there's going to be a lot of technological innovation over the next few years, and people adapting new software products, things being developed. And I think it's all for the better. People are really focusing more on what's important to the business, and some of the fluff, the needless travel, the needless entertainment, it's gone, and people realize that we don't really need it.
Right. Excellent perspective. Robert?
Yeah, everything that was just said, especially as Sam talked about the human element. I mean, I think we've seen this amazing enterprise level empathy and compassion sort of show up to care for employees. And I think that has to continue as we go forward, even after the pandemic tends to wind down. I think the big message for me is that, this idea that work, the way we work and where we work, it's been completely decoupled. We've absolutely demonstrated, at least across many of the knowledge worker industries, that, we can work from wherever. We're no longer place centric. You go to place to do different things in the future, right? It's some of the stuff that Eric talked about, intentionality, culture. I think that, we've now demonstrated that we can work in a very distributed way. We can work across this ecosystem of workplaces that I talked about. And I don't think that goes away. I think, and the shift of decision-making power to the employee about where that employee does their work, that's a really important shift. I've never seen that shift happen in my career, a shift of that magnitude. And I think that that's going to stick with us for a while, and it's going to have a very heavy influence on the decisions we make around workplace, corporate real estate, et cetera, because the employee is now mostly in charge of where they do their work. And so I think that's going to stick with us for a while, and certainly will create a fairly big shift in how we think about workplace.
Great. Eric, you wrap it up?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a word that we've all been talking about for quite a while around experience. And I think the rise of technology and our consumer mentality has allowed us to really consume a lot in terms of the volume of those interactions. It's allowed us to get to more people. It's allowed us to interact more frequently. And all of what we're talking about, and we think about this yearning to be together, and if you've had the experience of kind of being kind of away from people for a while, and you see that person you've been on the go-to meeting or the Zoom meeting with a lot, you want to give them a big hug, but you can't. I mean, there's this sort of substance over volume that is coming. So, I mean, that puts a lot of pressure on our physical environments and our programming of the environments to create meaningful experiences that you want to replicate or go back to, or again, it goes to that purpose. But what's the coolest thing I think about right now is that we're elevating the baseline of expectation. And we used to always talk about class B and C and A, and I don't think you can survive as a class C anymore. I mean, there's a baseline of expectation from a health and safety standpoint. There's a baseline of what you get when you go to the environment. So, from a workplace user or worker, you're going to have a better environment, and we've all collectively elevated the baseline of expectation. So that points to a pretty bright future for all of us that are in the field of creating better real estate environments.
Right. Well, it's a super way to end our conversation. I know I speak for everybody. I think this has just been phenomenal, and your perspectives are so interesting and diverse, and this has been a great hour together. We should do it again in 6 more months and see where we land. But I want to thank everybody who took the time to participate and listen in today. And I believe, Patrick, that you have recorded this, and we'll have some follow-up highlights from it as well, correct?
That is correct. We will send out a recording of the meeting and a deck with the summary notes included early next week.
Super. Well, thanks everybody. It was a pleasure to be with you, and look forward to seeing you all in person someday.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
you.
Karen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.